The Slack notification hit my screen at 9:17 a.m. Sharp. Right as I stepped off the elevator into the quiet hum of Apex Capital Partners' 42nd floor office in downtown Manhattan. No greeting. No context. Just a blunt demand. I need the shared drive password, and I need it now. Signed by Marcus Hale, the newly appointed VP of Operations. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, casting long shadows across the mostly empty desks. I set my coffee down carefully, staring at those words as if they might change if I blinked hard enough. I had been with Apex for 6 years, not as an employee, but as the owner of Rivera Tech Solutions, my consulting LLC. I kept the firm's compliance infrastructure running smoothly, those invisible pipelines that handled everything from SEC filings to investor audit trails. Most people at the firm barely noticed me. I wasn't at the holiday parties or the rooftop happy hours. I was the one behind the scenes, quietly renewing contracts, patching vulnerabilities, and making sure the regulatory machine never ground to a halt. My systems were licensed under Rivera Tech Solutions, not owned by Apex. They were built carefully, with layers of security and contractual protections designed precisely for moments like this. Marcus Hale was everything the corporate world loved to promote these days. Confident, sharply dressed, fresh from a high-profile turnaround at another hedge fund. He wore expensive watches and spoke in buzzwords: synergies, optimization, digital transformation. When he first arrived 3 months earlier, he had complimented my documentation during a team meeting. Then he suggested centralizing everything under his operations team. "Why pay a third party when we can bring it in-house?" he'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I explained gently that the environment wasn't a simple shared drive. It was a vendor-managed system with embedded automation, compliance monitoring, and strict contractual terms. He nodded, but I could see he had already made up his mind. In the following weeks, Marcus brought in external consultants with glossy slide decks full of pastel charts promising quick wins and cost savings. They flagged my services as shadow IT and redundant spend. During one sync call, Marcus circled the line item in red on screen and labeled it bloat. I reiterated over email that removing access without proper notice could violate the agreement. His reply was short: "We're streamlining." No questions, no deeper dive into the dependencies. He started revoking external permissions one by one, resetting API keys and cleaning up what he saw as clutter. I watched it happen without immediate pushback. There was no point arguing with someone who assumed he already knew everything. I archived my notes, double-checked my backups, and waited. The systems weren't his to control. They responded only to authorized vendor handshakes from Rivera Tech Solutions. By cutting me out, he wasn't just removing a contractor. He was severing the backbone that kept quarterly reports compliant, audit logs intact, and regulatory submissions on time. As the morning progressed, I could feel the tension building in the office. A few colleagues whispered about unusual system alerts popping up. Retention policies weren't queuing properly. Timestamp validations were failing silently. Marcus paced near the conference room, barking orders into his phone, still convinced this was a minor glitch he could fix with the right command. He had no idea the credentials he wiped were woven deep into schedulers that the entire firm depended on. Each reset without reauthorization was like yanking wires from a live engine. By 10 a.m., the first major red flags appeared on the compliance dashboard. Nightly audit trails stalled. The automated export to the SEC interface froze. Marcus's team scrambled, trying old recovery paths and pinging internal IT. But every attempt hit the same wall. Authentication required Rivera Tech Solutions license verification. The environment no longer recognized Apex's internal users. It was waiting for my authorization, which I was no longer contractually obligated to provide. I sat at my temporary workspace, watching the fallout unfold in real time through back channels. There was a strange mix of calm and anticipation. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I simply stopped servicing a contract that had been unilaterally terminated without the required 30-day negotiation window. The agreement I had written years ago was clear. Early termination without cause triggered material breach clauses, including penalties for continuity disruption. Marcus finally messaged again. More insistent. Password now or you're out by noon. I replied once. Cleanly. There is no password. This is a licensed vendor environment managed exclusively by Rivera Tech Solutions. Access requires contractual authorization. Then I logged out of the remaining panels and waited for the inevitable escalation. Word spread quickly. Legal was looped in. The CEO, Elena Vargas, a measured executive known for her steady hand, received forwarded copies of the exchange. Internal panic grew as more workflows failed. The quarterly CFO briefing, scheduled for later that morning, was quietly postponed. No one had access to finalized compliance packets or ledger exports. The house of cards Marcus thought he was streamlining had started to collapse under its own weight. In the background, colleagues who had relied on my systems for years began to piece together what had happened. They remembered the quiet fixes I provided during past audits, the custom scripts that saved hours of manual work, the reliability that let them focus on deals instead of paperwork. Now, with those supports gone, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Marcus still believed he could power through. He called an emergency huddle, demanding IT restore access immediately. But IT could only report the truth. The vendor space was isolated by design. And, without Rivera Tech Solutions' involvement, there was no visibility or control. The silence in the room was heavy. For the first time, doubt crept into Marcus's expression. The overconfident strategist who had swaggered in months earlier was beginning to sense the depth of the hole he had dug. As the morning wore on, the emotional weight settled over me, not anger exactly, but a profound recognition of how fragile these corporate assumptions could be. People like Marcus assumed that because they used something daily, they owned it. But usage isn't ownership. A Slack command couldn't rewrite 6 years of carefully constructed safeguards. The system was patient, waiting for proper authorization. And now it simply refused to move. The first formal outreach came from legal shortly after 11 a.m. A carefully worded email requesting a discussion about service restoration. I didn't respond personally. My attorney handled it, attaching the master agreement, breach timeline, and an initial invoice outlining potential damages under the penalty clause, north of $5 million based on disruption to regulatory filings and investor obligations. The office felt different that day. The usual hum of productivity was replaced by hushed conversations and frantic keyboard clicks. Marcus was called into a closed-door meeting with the CEO and general counsel. When he emerged, his face was pale, shoulders tense. The reality was sinking in. He hadn't just terminated a vendor. He had triggered a contractual breach that threatened the firm's compliance standing, delayed critical reports, and exposed them to regulatory scrutiny. I left the building that afternoon without drama, my access already revoked. But the story was far from over. The system stayed down. The penalties loomed, and Apex Capital Partners was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. The redundant vendor they tried to eliminate had been the only thing keeping their operations legally sound. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow-motion corporate disaster movie. Back at my home office in Brooklyn, I monitored the situation through indirect channels, old contacts, public filings, and the occasional discreet update from sympathetic colleagues. Apex's internal systems remained paralyzed. Compliance queues stalled completely. The automated retention protocols that normally ran like clockwork refused to initialize without vendor authorization. Daily integrity checks failed validation. leaving gaps in audit trails that could haunt the firm during the next regulatory review. Marcus Hale tried every workaround imaginable. His team attempted manual exports, legacy credential recoveries, even reaching out to the original consultants who had recommended the cuts. Nothing worked. Every path led back to the same authentication barrier, Rivera Tech Solutions' proprietary license required. The environment was designed that way intentionally for security, independence, and protection against exactly this kind of reckless internal overreach. Legal's full review of the master vendor agreement confirmed what I already knew. The contract, signed and renewed multiple times over 6 years, explicitly stated that access rested solely with the vendor of record. Termination required a 30-day negotiation window and mutual agreement. Marcus's slack termination without cause or notice constituted a material breach. The penalty clause was unambiguous: full compensation for service disruption plus damages calculated from lost productivity, regulatory exposure, and potential fines. The CEO, Elena Vargas, personally got involved. She was pragmatic, known for making tough calls but always with an eye toward long-term stability. Word was she read the agreement line by line in the executive conference room, her expression growing grimmer with each page. The room fell silent when she asked the critical question, "Who owns Rivera Tech Solutions?" The answer was me, Alex Rivera, the woman they had just locked out without a second thought. An apology email arrived on day 3. Not from Marcus, but from General Counsel herself. The tone was professional yet conciliatory, requesting an urgent call to discuss reconfiguration and restoration of services. They framed it as a mutual interest in continuity. My attorney responded with a formal breach notice and invoice, $5.2 million, itemized clearly under the contract terms. No emotion, just facts. Marcus was placed on administrative leave the same day. Officially, it was described as a personnel review related to policy compliance. Unofficially, it was damage control. The board was briefed. Investor Relations began preparing contingency statements in case news leaked about the compliance delays. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't vengeful. It was the deep validation of having built something robust enough to withstand corporate arrogance. Colleagues who had worked with me over the years started reaching out privately. One senior analyst admitted the dashboards had been running flawlessly for years thanks to my background scripts. Another mentioned how my automated redaction tools had saved the legal team countless hours during past audits. They had taken it for granted, assuming the systems were just there. Now they understood the invisible labor and contractual framework that made it possible. Negotiations began in earnest the following week. Apex proposed an emergency operations agreement to reinstate services while they worked through the breach fallout. The terms I insisted on through counsel were stricter. Any future termination would require dual signatures from legal and the board, plus a mandatory 90-day transition period. No more unilateral VP decisions. The price of reinstatement included back payment of the penalty and enhanced service fees reflecting the risk they had introduced. Marcus's fate was sealed quietly. He didn't appear in any further meetings or communications. Rumors suggested he was reassigned to a low-visibility role or encouraged to pursue opportunities elsewhere. The damage to his reputation within the firm, and potentially the industry, was significant. Overconfidence had cost him more than just a job title. It exposed fundamental gaps in how he approached complex systems and human dependencies. As services were gradually restored under the new agreement, the workflows hummed back to life one by one. Compliance packets queued again. Audit logs populated correctly. The SEC interface accepted uploads without error. It was as if the system had simply been paused, waiting patiently for proper authorization. Nothing was lost or corrupted because I had never touched the data after termination. I simply withheld the license support the contract no longer obligated me to provide. The reinstatement wasn't celebrated with fanfare. No company-wide announcement acknowledged my role or the incident. But within the teams that mattered, the message spread. The vendor they tried to delete had been essential. Institutional memory in finance firms has a long tail. Future executives might propose in-house rebuilds again, but the history of this breach would make them think twice. Reflecting on it now, the incident highlighted deeper truths about modern workplaces. Technology dependencies are often invisible until they fail. Contracts exist for a reason, not just as legal boilerplate but as safeguards against impulsive decisions. People like Marcus assume power flows from titles and access lists, but true leverage often resides in the footnotes, the quiet expertise, and the systems built with foresight. The Monday morning compliance run, at 3 a.m., resumed its rhythm. The ping from Apex's servers reached out to the Rivera Tech Solutions endpoint embedded deep in their infrastructure. Handshake complete. The logs recorded success, without fanfare. The machine didn't need praise or recognition. It simply required respect for its architecture. Yet the question lingers: how many other critical vendors remain invisible until someone decides to streamline them away? In a world obsessed with efficiency and quick wins, the cost of ignoring contracts and human elements can be measured not just in dollars, but in lost trust and operational fragility. The weeks following reinstatement brought a new normal to Apex Capital Partners. Services ran smoothly again, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Colleagues moved with a bit more caution when discussing system changes. Legal reviews became more thorough for vendor-related decisions. The incident served as a quiet case study in what happens when arrogance meets contractual reality. I returned to my role with clear boundaries and stronger protections. Billing resumed, now with the enhanced terms we had negotiated. The $5.2 million penalty was settled as part of the reinstatement package, paid out over several quarters to avoid public disclosure. Apex avoided any major regulatory hit, but the internal audit notes carried a permanent flag about the disruption period, a reminder etched into their compliance history. Marcus Hale's departure was confirmed quietly a month later. He was no longer listed in the company directory. No farewell email. No LinkedIn post announcing his next chapter. The firm simply moved on, as large organizations often do. His replacement was chosen more carefully, with input from legal on operational due diligence. For me, the experience reinforced the importance of documentation and self-protection in consulting work. I updated my standard contracts across other clients, adding even clear language around termination and breach remedies. The satisfaction wasn't loud or triumphant. It was the quiet knowledge that the systems I built had proven resilient precisely because they were designed to withstand misuse. Word of the incident spread discreetly within New York finance circles. A few recruiters and peers reached out with cautious curiosity. Some shared similar stories of vendors being undervalued until crisis struck. The lesson traveled: never assume ownership simply because you have daily access. Respect the contracts, the people, and the hidden layers that keep everything running. The systems at Apex continued their automated routines with perfect reliability. Every compliance check, every time-stamped backup, every scheduled export performed exactly as designed. The ping at 3 a.m. Monday morning still resolved successfully, recorded simply as handshake complete. No drama, no awards, just consistent delivery. Yet the deeper moral question remains: in our rush to optimize and cut costs, how often do we overlook the human expertise and contractual frameworks that truly power our organizations? The price of that oversight isn't always immediate, but when it comes, it can be devastating.